can't believe that another year is in the bag, so it's time for a channel update. My 2023 has primarily been devoted to finishing my Dungeon Crawl board game low. Back in April, I went from the alpha to the feature complete, component complete beta version of the game. So I did a bunch of beta testing on the game and realized that the game needed a ton of work. And I spent the next 4 to 5 months doing a refactor on the game, updating every single asset, rewriting the rule books. And then I released a release candidate 1 back in September, October, I think. It went a lot better, but the game still needs a lot of work. I'm down to 2 pages of to-do items. I had a couple options. One was to spend the entire holiday season buried in my laptop, working in Photoshop, and shelving all my real world concerns and just trying to push this game out. The other option was to step back. I've been pushing really hard for a really long time, and I really just kind of hit a wall with it in November and decided that I not just want a break, but need a break from it. My plan is to hit the ground running in January, knock out the final 2 pages of to-do items, finish up the redesign on the monster cards, do another round of testing, and then see where we're at. So this game could take, honestly, another 3 to 6 months to ship. Unfortunately, that's just what a one-man studio looks like. This is not a business endeavor. This is a passion project. I don't expect to ever make a single dime off this game. I will be selling it at cost, and it'll ship when I feel super stoked about it. But other than the hundreds of hours that I've spent on my board game this year, a lot of other cool things happened. Spent some time in Copenhagen, Stockholm, Oslo, and lots of game shops. Pretty fun to dive into this stuff. I'm realizing that these are really just art books for me. I'm never gonna sit down and have a Morkborg RPG session. I'm never gonna play Death in Space. These are interesting rule sets that are fun to read and wrap my brain around, and I really just love the artwork and the design and the presentation. I also spent some time getting into some old school D&D rules. Of all the old school rules that I read this year, I think I like the white box. I was once again enthralled with the comic book shop scene in Paris. The French understand comics better than anyone, in my opinion, except for, maybe the Japanese. And I came home with this wonderful bilingual Art of Arzak book, which has been profoundly inspirational. Also found a deck of Milo Manara tarot cards. Huge fan of his erotic illustrations. Spent a lot of time in art museums this year too, in Paris and in Scandinavia and here in the States. And it's kind of reignited my love for looking at analog art. It uses a completely different part of the brain than just doom scrolling on YouTube and Instagram. I wanted to try some small box Dungeon Crawl board games because my Dungeon Crawl board game is a small box game. I think there's plenty of space for the weight and style of these games, and I'm glad they exist. But I think what I'm trying to do is not better, but it's very different than what these 2 games are trying to do. I'm trying to do something a little heavier, but with the same footprint. And it's tricky, it's hard. These games have shipped, so they are successful. And my game has not shipped. I needed to dip my toes into the world of the small box Dungeon Crawl board games. There's a few others that I want to try, and I probably will over the next few months. It really helps me figure out where my game stands in the grand scheme of things. And then for big box games, I wanted to try something more complex, more complicated, more fiddly. And of all the games that I researched out there, this was the one that kind of appealed the most to me. I don't even know why really, but I bought it, I got it to the table, I learned it. It's complicated, it's fiddly, but to my surprise, I really, really enjoyed this game. I only got through the first couple quests. I don't think I will buy expansions, and I think everything I need out of Sword and Sorcery exists in this base box. There's a fair amount of crunch and complexity to the game, but it's all very learnable, It just takes a little bit of time and patience to get there with it. So that kind of brings me up to the end of the year here, and I've been trying to figure out how I can continue to exercise my creative mind while also taking a break from the tedious low revisions in Photoshop. I really want to do more analog painting. My education is in fine art with a specialty in painting, and now I'm like 51 years old and I still don't feel confident with paint. Up until now, I've been doing these pen and ink sketches and scanning them in and then coloring them in Photoshop and doing a ton of revisions and a ton of iterating on them and finally arriving at an image. There's a sterility to Photoshop, and I know there's a lot of Photoshop masters out there that can do work that's indistinguishable from analog art, and I think that's great. But I want the happy accidents of the brushwork. My primary objective is to ship my game, but my secondary process is going to be learning to finally paint, like really, really learn how to paint. I've basically been on this deep research project in my own library. A lot of these books are books that I've had for years. Out of all the artwork that I've ever studied, I love gouache illustrations. And this goes all the way back to like early Star Wars concept art. This really is the type of stuff that I want to learn how to paint. I want to learn how to paint this. And I want to learn how to paint this. I want these kinds of textures, these kinds of colors. There's a couple of different YouTube channels where these gouache masters will do like a 3-hour demo and basically show every single brush stroke, and they talk about process during the entire video. And I would say that that has been more educational than my entire 5 years of art school. That is the beauty of YouTube when it comes to educational content. You can learn anything now from a grand master on YouTube in a matter of hours. Of course, it takes, months, years of practice, but the knowledge is all there now for the taking. So these are all the books that are extremely inspirational to me. This is a master course in gouache right here. Sid Mead, his gouache concept art for Blade Runner, pretty much made that movie what it was, along with the brilliant idea from Philip K. Dick to begin with. Art of Atari. This is a perfect example of the type of imagery that I want to learn to paint. And then it finally dawned on me one day that gouache was the key, the missing ingredient. And I bought the gouache paints, and of course I just sat on them for years because that's what happens, right? I think it's finally time to learn gouache. I've even had this book on how to illustrate with gouache for years. There's just some really practical, useful information like how to paint copper, how to paint metal. Another source of inspiration for the art direction for Shadows of Brimstone just nailed it. This is an image that I want to do a study of, and there's just such a nice atmospheric vibe going on here. It's probably a digital painting, but if it is, it's a great example of a digital painting that looks analog. If this is analog, that's even extra cool. Since color intimidates me so much, I'm like, well, I should just limit the number of colors I have, and that'll protect me from decision paralysis when it comes to color mixing. So the Zorn palette uses titanium white, ivory black, yellow ochre, and like a cadmium red. And it varies. Everyone's got their own version of the Zorn palette. And then so the goal is to try to mix as many colors as you can from these 4 basic colors. And so then I immediately realized when I started my first image that I needed some blues. So I think between the Zorn palette and then these extra primary colors that I got, this is pretty much every color that I would need. So the very first study I did was He-Man, and I ripped this from the cover of the Art of Masters of the Universe book, and it was really hard. I didn't even pencil this first, so originally this nose was like an inch too long and the mouth was way down here, and the whole thing just looked grotesquely distorted. And so I had to go back and like shorten the nose by an inch, and I had to move the entire mouth up. And you can see this entire mouth is like kind of tilted a little too far, just because I was working on little pieces of the painting at a time and wasn't really stepping back and looking at the whole thing at once. Gouache can be kind of finicky. You can lift up layers that you've already applied, but you can also ruin those layers. You can paint over previous layers if you have the right amount of paint on the brush and not too much water. So there's all these like little tricks with gouache. And then I was studying the work of Hector Garrido. He did all the G.I. Joe packaging art, or at least a lot of it. When I was 10, I started buying G.I. Joe action figures. And, for every hour that I spent playing with my G.I. Joes, I spent at least twice that much time just staring at the art, because in my mind, the G.I. Joe universe was the art, and these figures were really just proxies. This painting style has haunted me for 41 years. And I would say even when I went to college, I desperately wanted to learn how to do this stuff. But as I've talked about before, most of my professors were really into the abstract expressionist movement. And this was not acceptable. Nobody was doing this kind of illustration at my art school. Everybody was doing big, gigantic oil paintings with big, chunky paint. I'm not really a toy collector. I don't plan to go down the rabbit hole with action figures, but I really wanted some of the original that used the old Hector Garrido art. So I learned a lot with this painting. Once again, I probably spent 5 or 6 hours on it, and there's still like huge issues with it, namely the hand. And then I found this Chinese toy line. Joy Toy is the name of the company. They come with like multiple sets of hands with lots of different poses, and they're 4-inch figures, which are about the same size as these old G.I. Joe figures, but they have like 4 or 5x the number of joints, so they're highly articulated. Like a lot of the fantasy art that I want to make for my board game requires these types of action poses with these types of medieval weapons. These warriors cover a lot of the bases. Like they come with swords, they come with shields. It just seemed like a reasonable experiment to try to use action figures as art reference, especially for my fantasy worlds. And then I decided I was going to paint each one of my younger nephews a painting for Christmas. So I asked their mom which heroes were their favorites, and my 5-year-old nephew said Master Yoda. And I've already wrapped this painting, so all I have is a printout of it. And I learned a lot with this piece as well, namely how to like use whites, rim lighting. So every painting I do kind of unlocks some new little trick, because painting is really just a bag of tricks combined with like a ton of experience. And then my other nephew, my 9-year-old nephew, said Blastoise as a Pokemon character. My first priority for 2024 is to finish low, and there's a lot of tedious revisions coming up, but I am looking forward to shipping the game. And then I think my secondary process for 2024 is how to become a proficient gouache illustrator. So as always, a special thanks to everyone who has swung by in 2023 to check out my projects and my creative process. A special thanks to all the inner circle surrounding the development of Low. Some of you have been around now for a couple years plus, and there are some newcomers that have been instrumental in the release candidate 1 testing, and I just really appreciate everybody who's taken an active interest in the game. I can promise you that the game will ship. I just don't know when, but I really look forward to it.